Of course. I know, right? Okay, it just gives you a good point about them from earlier. I know, Eve, you assume? Of course. I spooned a lot, Vigily. I know, right? Yep, it always does, definitely. I'm not sure I realized that, by the way. I'm not sure, by the way. Right, of course. It always does, definitely. Yep, I spooned that for a while. Course. Yep, it just gives me a good point if I could assume, by the way. Course. If you could assume, by the way. Right, of course. It always does, definitely. I know, if you could assume. Course. I know, right? I spent a lot, Vigily. Course. Yep, it always does, definitely. Course. If I was gonna know this. If I could assume, by the way. Course. Yep, just gives me a good point. If I could assume, by the way. Didn't know this so far? Right, of course. It always does, definitely. Yep, it just gives me a good point about them. If you consume, course. Yep, it always does, definitely. Right, I spooned a lot, usually. If you consume, yep, it just gives me a good point about them. Because I have no idea where they are, usually. I consume they're right, definitely. I didn't know this. So, you consume? Yep, it just gives me a good point. Of course, it always does, definitely. I know, right? Yep. It just gives me a good point about the others. I know. So you consume? Yep. Of course. I know, right? I spooned that for a while. If you consume? Yep. Of course. Always does, definitely. I know, right? If you consume, actually? Of course. Yep. Agree. If you consume.